Hello, and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. Thank you for joining us online tonight. 13 days ago, police in Minneapolis murdered a Black man in cold blood, under cover of authority. Since then, ordinary people around the world have come together in a way never before seen. They have united their voices to call for an end to illegitimate authority, to call for a final end to the long, sad, and maddening history of police brutality directed against the African American community. There can be no mistaking the fact that the events of the last 2 weeks are historic. Never before has the protest of police brutality been so sustained, day after day after day. Never before has such protest been so widespread, from small towns in East Texas and the Midwest to white suburbs in every state to major cities around the country and around the globe, and to the front steps of the White House. And all of this is taking place in the midst of a global pandemic and global economic collapse. And it's an election year. It's all a lot to take on board, but our guest this evening is especially suited to helping us understand what's going on. Selected in 1985 by Mrs. Coretta Scott King to edit and publish the papers of her late husband, Stanford University historian Clayborne Carson has devoted most of his professional life to the study of Martin Luther King Jr. and, especially for tonight, the movements King inspired. Under Carson's direction, the King Papers Project has produced 7 volumes of a definitive, comprehensive edition of King's speeches, sermons, correspondence, publications, and unpublished writings. In 2005, the King Papers Project became part of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University, with Dr. Carson serving as its founding director. Clay Carson, welcome to Other Voices. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. So let me just ask, how have you been with all the lockdown and everything? Are you sheltering in place okay?
I find that there's a certain benefit to that. I get to spend more time with my wife and my family, and I find that working with my immediate staff, we're fine with it. I don't think we want to go back to normal life.
That's great.
This has been a learning experience.
Yeah, and you're retired from teaching, so you haven't been doing any of the Zoom teaching.
No, but I'm not retired from teaching. I still teach an online course. Anyone wanting to take it can go to edX and take my online course and actually meet with me on Monday afternoons for what I used to call an office hour, but I thought it would be better to call it an office chat. It's less intimidating.
Yeah.
Since my students rarely came to office hour. So I'm just calling it come in and chat with the professor.
Okay, well, I'll get that information from you and we'll send it out to all the attendees tonight, because we will have their email addresses and we'll let them know how they can take advantage of that. So let me start with where I kind of started at the beginning during my introduction. That the historic nature of what's been going on, we've certainly, sadly, seen many protests over the years in the wake of such a brutal police killing. Time and time again, people take to the streets. Black Lives Matter becomes an everyday phrase in the language. But it feels like this time around, something qualitatively different has taken hold. As I said in the introduction, these protests have been sustained day after day for 2 weeks now. They have been more widespread than anything we've seen in the past, with huge numbers of people coming out in places you wouldn't expect people to be coming out. What's your general take on what we've been seeing the last couple of weeks?
Well, first of all, to provide some historical context, I was at the March on Washington as a 19-year-old in 1963. And I know something about all the work that went into organizing that protest.
Yeah.
You know, you had some of the best organizers of the 20th century, Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, all the major civil rights organizations. And they pulled together. Since I was a 19-year-old, I had nothing whatsoever to do with pulling it together. They pulled together 200,000 people in Washington that day. And here, just a couple of weeks ago, something happens, and young people, the age I was then, put together something that has brought more people than attended the March on Washington out into the streets in many cities throughout the country. And I just want to say thanks. I mean, this is something historic. This is something where you find the power of young people. And I was thinking of some of the parallels from the 60s, and the closest I came to was the sit-ins that began in 1960, you know, which were begun by first-year college students at Greensboro, North Carolina, and they sparked a movement that really set the stage for the 1960s. And none of them were over 20. You know, I think they used the technology of their day, but it was mainly one of the qualities of young people is that they take risks. They are willing to put their bodies on the line. They have less to lose than older people. And by doing so, they were able to really spur Martin Luther King into action. Because quite frankly, since the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956, when it ended, Martin Luther King hadn't really been doing very much. And here we have a movement from the grassroots saying, you know, we want to take.
We want action.
Yeah, I mean, you know, sometimes, you know, I think, you know, that was what inspired me. And I think we weren't following King. King was following us. We were out in front of him. And that's the way I felt about it. And that's what I try to reflect in my own writing, even though I certainly admired Martin Luther King, all of us did. But we weren't waiting for him to take the initiative.
Yeah, you weren't sitting around waiting for Dr. King and his group to decide what's next. There were lots of self-motivated organizers getting out there and doing what they thought needed to be done in their own community. And I think it's that spirit that we're seeing again in town after town. I don't know how many accounts I've read of just protests organized in this area by people 19, 18, 17 and younger. Almost invariably, they're all saying, it's the first time I've ever done anything like this. And it surprised me. I was expecting 20 people and 500 showed up.
Yeah, some of you probably went to the one at Palo Alto, and the organizers stepped forward, and 2 of them were 18 and 2 of them were 20.
Yeah.
And that was probably the largest protest I've seen in Palo Alto. So it was striking, that ability. But again, when we look at it in the recent history, what we see is that the students in Parkland, you know, after the shootings there,
Yes.
they organized a March on Washington. And so at that march, King's granddaughter spoke to a larger audience than Martin Luther King had ever spoken to during his lifetime.
I hadn't heard it ever quite put that way, but that's really interesting. And she was terrific. She was absolutely terrific.
You know, I met her. She came to the recent conference at Stanford. I think you were there, and many of your organization was there. And she's kind of gives an indication that the new generation is not going to be waiting for us for guidance. They're going to take it on their own, and I think that that's wonderful.
And I really appreciate you saying at the outset to express your gratitude to these young people. I I feel exactly the same way. What about the how intensively this has been sustained for 2 weeks now? There weren't a lot of reports of demonstrations today, but I think that's because the actual funeral was today. But where do you see this going? Is this going to keep going like this? Do you think there'll be daily demonstrations for a while? And what made it so sustainable this time? Last time, Ferguson, most of the demonstrations were pretty much done within a week. This time, it just keeps building.
Well, I think the difference is that this is something that people can be doing from their stay-at-home orders.
Yeah.
I saw an article in the Washington Post, and they were interviewing people and finding out, what do they feel about the protests and whether they would last. And one of the persons said, look, I have nothing but time on my hands. This is not, it's not like I have a job to go to. It's not like I have school to go to. This is something that has meaning in my life. So I think that there is something about the special circumstances of the pandemic that we are experiencing that that allows people to have the time to sustain this. But I think also young people, one of the things they have is the ability to take risk, to venture out, and they obviously are taking a risk, and they realize that. You see a lot of them wearing the mask, and they realize that there's a higher risk being in a crowd of contracting COVID and perhaps dying or bringing it home to somebody. And they're willing to take that risk. And when I was actually, this is somewhat off the wall, but I was thinking of the lyric from Taylor Swift's song "Only the Young Can Run," and it brought home a truism that there are certain things that young people can do better than old people, besides running, and maybe in addition to running. And I think that ability to take risk for something greater, to risk going to jail and what that might mean. And it reminds me of me when I was a teenager. I going to the March on Washington and later working in Los Angeles and getting arrested. And, there is that fear, oh, am I going to damage my entire future career? What is this going to mean? And when you're 19, 20, 21, those risks seem more reasonable. And I think that is something that always has made youthful protests more vigorous. When we think back, I was thinking of the parallels to this and thinking back to the sit-ins of 1960 and how the movements of the 60s were launched by 4 teenagers in Greensboro, North Carolina, who sat in at a lunch counter. And it set off a wave of sit-ins. It was like, with the technology of that day, which was television, radio, newspapers and other things like that, gradually people understood those guys in Greensboro have something. That's something I can do. I might not be able to do a lot of things, but I can go and sit at a lunch counter. I can go and sit in someplace and disrupt society in that way and risk going to jail. And that led directly to the Freedom Rides of the following year. And so I think that this notion that young people have some special qualities that old people just don't have. Just on a personal confession, it was my daughter and granddaughter who went to the protests until the protest came to Palo Alto.
Right.
And I realized that I could just take a walk, which I greatly need from sitting at home, and join the protests at Palo Alto City Hall. So, so yeah, I mean, there are certain things that young people can do better than older people, and I think that youth protests, well, among other things, the idea of organizing something that is bigger than the March on Washington in a couple of days.
Yes.
That was a remarkable achievement. And I think somebody should say thank you for that, that otherwise that moment might have been lost. But instead it became a movement because people reacted to that through social media and other means, and made sure that this was not going to be something that was simply ignored. Just think back 2 weeks ago, if only people over 30 were involved in protests, what would have happened after the death of George Floyd? What would have happened? Would anything have happened? Would anything have happened along the scale that happened during these last 2 weeks? I doubt it.
Yeah, I doubt it too. And there's a couple other things that really strike me about how different this is this time around. The youth leadership is something we've been seeing developing since the March for Our Lives, and youth have really taken the lead in the climate change action. And by the way, for those who are tuned in here, please be sure to keep checking our email list, because I am hoping to round up some of these young organizers from this area and have them on here on Other Voices Online. But Dr. Carson, the other thing that really struck me is how widespread these protests and support was. The public opinion polls are showing 65 and 70% support for these protests. And I can't think of anything much that has garnered that much widespread support in these opinion polls, especially these days. What do you make of that, this widespread support?
I think if you had done a poll among Black Americans about their reactions to the sit-ins, it would have been that level of support.
Yes.
I think that what has happened that is a hopeful change is that now it's not simply Black Americans. I was greatly affected with news of the sit-ins of 1960. I think that sparked my own activism, but I'm not sure if my white classmates paid any attention to that.
Right.
But today, that's something where the cultural signals can come from the Black community rather than the white community. And white kids pick up on that. And that's something that is new. It's not that the cultural, political leadership is coming from white people. I think particularly in the progressive community, the leadership is coming from Black people and brown people. Black Lives Matter is, Black and queer women, sparking that movement. Can you imagine 50 years ago that
Right.
would have been the case? So I think we're in a new era where the leadership is not going to come from, white men or women or Black or white with gray hair. It's just not going to happen.
Right.
And that's the way it should be.
It's a healthy development, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, part of my critique of the 1960s and in my writing is that, yes, I studied the work of Martin Luther King now, but my first book was on SNCC, which was always an irritant to Martin Luther King, because the people in SNCC thought that he was following them. And,
For those who
and
may not remember, let's just translate that. That's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
right, yeah, that was the group that included people like Diane Nash and John Lewis and um, Bernard Lafayette and James Bevel, and all these people that most people probably don't even recognize those names, but those are the ones who um, really were the spark of the 1960s. Martin Luther King reacted to them, and even before the Montgomery bus boycott, two teenagers were arrested for the same thing that Rosa Parks was arrested for. But the community did not become aroused by their arrests.
Yeah.
And so Claudette Colvin and Mary Louise Smith, one of the things that I remember us doing at the King Institute, well, maybe back then it was the King Papers Project, but in any case, we invited them to come out to Stanford. And we felt that it was just unfair that everyone remembers Rosa Parks. But before Rosa Parks, there were these two teenagers who did the same thing.
Huh.
Because they were not seen as, oh, well, you can't rally around these disobedient teenagers. And names like Barbara Johns in Farmville, Virginia, who led a student walkout against inferior Black schools in 1951. She
Wow.
organized the students, walked out, went to the Board of Education and demanded not desegregation, and that's kind of significant. She was demanding, why don't you make the Black school equal to the white school?
Interesting.
Why are we have inferior facilities? All of these sorts of things. She was protesting against that in 1951. And she appealed to the NAACP, and finally they sent some lawyers and they said, well, if you join our legal case that we have going, we'll help you. And that legal case was called Brown versus Board of Education. But what that legal case was trying to do was desegregate the schools, which ironically actually hurt her purpose, because what desegregation meant for the schools in Farmville, Virginia, is that they closed.
Yeah.
Rather than desegregate, they simply closed the Black schools. So they got not just inferior education, they got no education. So I think we have to, when we look back and try to understand the role of young people in the movement, sometimes they were much wiser than the older people in the movement. They understood the essence of the problem. And, that protest, I think, her name should be in the history books. Well, she is in my history books.
Yeah, she's
but not in other people's history books. So I think that these acts need to be recognized, and I think now we have no choice but to ignore them, because no person over 30 can claim to have been responsible for what has happened in the last 2 weeks.
And not only is the youth leadership being recognized, but it seems to me that a broader audience is finally taking on board the actual message. And what I'm thinking of when I say that is when the term Black Lives Matter was developed out of, I believe it was Ferguson when that first came up, that it was criticized. We heard people.
I think it was actually after the shooting by the self-appointed community guard in, what was in Florida?
Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
I think that was actually when the phrase was probably first used.
Thank you for correcting me on that. But my point was going to be that there was a lot of backlash to just that phrase, and we heard a lot of all lives matter and back and forth. I don't think we've heard that this time, and in fact, we had a United States senator from the state of Utah saying Black Lives Matter out on Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House this past week. Mitt Romney, of course. The other aspect of this I want to go into a little bit and then try to move this on is the international nature of these protests these last couple of weeks. What do you make of that? That cities all over Europe and Asia and everywhere you can imagine have taken to the streets as well with the same messages.
Well, all I have to do is look at my own Facebook page. You know, where are my followers? A
Yeah,
lot of them are outside the United States. You know, who are following me on Twitter. You know, this is the nature of the world today. That people all over the world can be connected in ways that were inconceivable a decade ago, decades ago.
yeah,
Uh, so I think that's again one of the natures. I think young people are more connected to each other throughout the world than connected to older people in the United States.
I think that's a really good observation. Yeah, that's right.
And you know, just listen to the music they listen to. Listen to, you know, they're more aware of people in other countries who are affecting them culturally. So I think that that's something that is, you know, to me it kind of gets back to King's last book. You know, where do we go from here? And he talked about the World House. You know, how are we going to learn in a very culturally diverse world that how to live together in this house that we've inherited.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I think that what we've seen is that young people are farther along that path than we are as older people. I'm hoping to catch up, but you know, that's part of the purpose of trying to bring together what we call the Gandhi King Global Network.
Right.
You know, every Friday I have a discussion, and anyone is welcome to join it who wants to. But it's a global discussion. A regular part of that are people from South Africa, India, you know, Europe, South America. It's a small group. I think it'll grow, but it's from the very beginning very international. And I think you saw that at our conference in October, marking the
What you were trying to
100th.
launch was an international group like this.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it had, you know, the grandson and granddaughter of Gandhi, the son and granddaughter of King, and the offspring of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. You know, all of them were there on the same stage.
Yeah.
It was a really historical event that might not ever happen again. So I think that what we're seeing is that these movements and these leaders have global importance. And that's made possible by social media. But I think it's also just made possible by the fact that you have a whole generation of young people around the world who think that they've been screwed by the system. You know, that they have inherited a world in which a handful of people control as much wealth as many countries, as entire continents in fact, in terms of Africa. And they know that that's unfair. You know, there's no way that a trillionaire in the United States works harder and is more creative and is more productive than the people of an entire continent. So so they know that the system is rigged. And that globalization has made it, the primary result of it has been a search for the cheapest possible labor. And oftentimes that's no labor at all. It's a machine or a computer that does the labor.
Right.
And yet a few people reap the profits of that system. And that's something that they know inherently is unfair. I don't think they know quite what the solution to that is.
Right.
I think that's where that's where older people, I think, fit in. I think older people who are progressive historians, economists, other people can let them know why is the system rigged? What might be done to make it more fair? I just as an anecdote, I when the Super Bowl was here, I was invited to a reception, probably by mistake. It involved a number of people who were part of the entertainment world and the people who were advertising in the Super Bowl, and we had a kind of a get together, and everyone kind of got to offer some thoughts about the world situation. And I suggested that one of the ways you could distribute wealth was to cut patent and copyright so that they didn't last as long, maybe half as long as they do now.
Right.
And I said that would redistribute wealth as much as any single legal change.
Interesting.
And there was a loud silence, and it was kind of like, why did we let the skunk in the room? Because these were entertainment people who live on their
off of that, yeah.
Their royalties and their, so we have to start thinking in those terms. Jefferson talked about, we need a revolution every 20 years.
Right.
Well, if that's true, and I don't think he meant it literally a violent revolution, but if that's true, why do we have copyright laws that last 75 years?
Yes.
That makes no sense. This has nothing to do with rewarding the inventor, when the inventor is a corporation that goes on forever.
Yeah.
So, we need to think in terms of how we are hamstringing, how we are damaging the next generation by handing them a world in which they really have a lot of debt and very little opportunity.
And I think they are learning that lesson. We have had some presidential candidates who were glad to talk about the rigged system, but I think the young people are learning it and observing it on their own. I do want to get to our audience and open this up for questions, comments, and your replies. It's always a major part of Other Voices, but I just want to briefly, before I do that, there's still more hard work ahead. People are calling for police reforms, and there is going to be bills in Congress. Maybe we can talk about some of those details during the Q&A with the audience. But this is really going to require, I think, a lot more organizing in the future at a local level, because most of the rules that cover police tactics and police violence and the over-militarization of police are not at the federal level. Congress can only do so many things. They are really at the local level. What are your thoughts about how we take this mass mobilization, sudden mobilization in the streets, and turn that into an effective reform movement aimed at militarized police forces around this country in hundreds and hundreds of individual towns?
Well, I think we can, again, the role of the older people is to say it wasn't always this way. That part of the militarization of the police started in the 1960s. Started with the Black rebellions and the efforts to provide, a lot of times surplus weapons from the military fighting in Vietnam, supplying them to the police departments, setting up SWAT squads, that are designed to be paramilitary units. All of this is part of the problem. But I think that, one of the things that would be kind of interesting would be to go back to the Menlo Park experiment. Some of your audience might be aware that when, during the 1970s, I moved to Menlo Park, and the police were disarmed. They wore blazers rather than uniforms.
Wow.
That experiment went on for a number of years under a very progressive police chief. And it basically ended, maybe some of your listeners might correct me, but it basically ended because the people in the police force did not feel respected by other police forces. So if a Menlo Park police officer came over to Palo Alto wearing the blazer, would they be seen as a real policeman? And also, do ordinary citizens view them as in the same way that they would with the guy with the gun? And so there have been, in Compton, there's experiments still going on about how to change the nature of policing. So we have these experiments, and I think part of it is social acceptance, but it's also changing a deeply rooted culture. Racism is not simply an individual action, it's something that's deeply rooted in a culture. And culture is a difficult thing to change.
Yes, indeed.
And especially if you're the new guy coming into the police department, you cannot change the culture. I feel a certain amount of sympathy for the guy who was, I think, on his fourth day of service.
Third or fourth day, yes.
Yeah, and he's looking at the senior officer on the scene, and he's saying, oh my gosh, if I intervene, they will see me as weak. They will see me as not suitable to join their culture. And I can understand. He'll probably get convicted, but I can understand that hesitancy.
Yeah.
You do not want to, if you're the outsider, you're the newcomer. You take your cultural cues from those who have been there longer. And that's the nature of the culture of racism, is you take your cues from your neighbors, you take your cues from those who are around you and who have been in the system longer. And I think that that's something that's going to take some time to change. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to ever change quickly, but hopefully, we'll get to the point where a young kid who's part of the protesters today might actually decide that law enforcement is a good profession for me, that I might fit in there and I might do some good. Because some laws do need to be enforced. I mean, people should not be harming other people. They should not be stealing other people's property. But the question is, what do you do to stop that from happening?
That is indeed the question of the day, and let's bring our audience in to help us with that question, whatever questions they have. For those of you who are new to this, what you need to do is find the little raise your hand icon on your screen and just click on that, and then wait till I call on you. And then when you're called on, you'll get a notice that you're being upgraded to a panelist, and you will have to click on your own start video. Zoom doesn't allow us to start your video. So watch for that and be sure to click on your start video when you do that. And I need these to see the first name. Gavin Wright has their hand up, and after that will be Cheryl Spencer. So Gavin, if you can join us on here.
Hi, Gavin.
And it takes just a few seconds for them to actually show up on here. Do we have Gavin? Where is Gavin?
I'll bet the first person who really understands your instruction is somebody under 30. No, there's Gavin.
No,
There's
Gavin.
Gavin.
I do not understand them, and I'm not under 30, so I'll confirm your hypothesis.
Well, I'm glad you made it, Gavin. Thank you for joining us. What's your question or comment?
I'm a longstanding colleague of Clay's at Stanford. I'm in the economics department. But Clay, I saw that you were quoted in a Stanford Reports interview saying that it was very important that the Black Lives Matter movement develop specific achievable goals so that all of this energy that's now on the rising segment for the last couple of weeks and presumably some weeks, but it's not going to continue unless there's something to show for it. So I won't ask you to say what those goals should be, because you will say, well, it's not up to you and it's not up to me either. But can you give us some guidance as to how the people should go about trying to formulate those goals so that they can look ahead to some real accomplishments in coming weeks?
Thank you.
You know, Gavin, one of the things about that interview that I somewhat regret is that it had a headline of, you know, the movement needs leadership, and it was kind of interpreted as, you know, kind of a Martin Luther King style of leadership. And you know, I think that was a mistake. It's not the goal of the individual protester to suggest individual reforms any more than when I went to the March on Washington for me to draft the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You know, it is always going to be people who are, you know, lawyers and, you know, other people who are more adept at translating discontent into specific reforms. And, you know, reforming the police is going to be difficult. But as I mentioned with the Menlo Park experiment, you know, there have been cities that have defunded their police and moved to other models. The fact that we have the entire world as a model. You know, one of the first things that I did when this thing started happening is just do a quick search on law enforcement killings of civilians and looked at how the United States kills 100 times, more than 100 times more than any other comparable nation. You know, it's last count, I guess, in the Washington Post, about 1,000 in the United States, 3 in Great Britain. Great Britain is a multinational place. You know, people commit crimes in Great Britain. So how do other countries, you know, we no one in their right mind would recommend that other countries look to the United States for how to do policing. We need to be modest enough, humble enough to look to other countries to say, how do you do policing without killing so many people? And that might mean going to the point of disarming the police. You know, it's you know, people think of that as a radical solution. That has happened in some countries where, as a routine matter, if you have like a active shooter situation, you might call on a special unit of the police to deal with that. But the vast majority of things that police deal with on an everyday basis are domestic disputes, drug-related issues, someone who tries to pass a bad $20 bill. You know, that why would that situation even require an armed policeman to be there? So I think that's where we need to, it's not the job of the protester to write the legislation. You know, if that were true, then anyone would not protest against something that they have gone to a Stanford class to study. So we need to get away from that notion that because you are protesting about a bad situation, the obligation is on you to find the solution. The obligation is on those people at Stanford to find the solution.
And often you're supposed to show up at the protest with the solution in hand and define it.
Yeah, exactly.
On the fly. Let's move on. We have one other hand up here right now, Cheryl Spencer, and if we can get Cheryl on there, and then make sure, Cheryl, you unmute yourself and put your video on. Do we have Cheryl on? She must be in transition.
Okay, here I am.
Okay.
I'm going to start my video. Okay.
Okay, welcome,
Right.
Cheryl.
Yes, good evening. I just wanted to talk a little more about culture and what I see happening from my position as a retired physicist. So tomorrow, the American Physical Society, that is the professional society of 53,000 physicists, many abroad, most in the US, they are standing down. They will not be open for business. The societies in Maryland, it's at their headquarters there. They will be reflecting on what more they can do to get more Black physicists. It's not that we don't already have a whole bunch of initiatives that have been going on for years, but they will stand down, and the president and the presidential line will discuss amongst themselves what they can do. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is all scientists, is also standing down tomorrow. We're all asked to cease our research and give some reflection as to what we can do about this terrible racism that the country suffers from. I'm also a member of very many different organizations like museums. So the Asian Art Museum wrote to me the other day and admitted that their historical art collection from Asia is based on one from Avery Brundage. And his collection forms the nucleus. He was a racist and an anti-Semitic person. He's now dead, but they, realize that they need to acknowledge that and deal with who's on their board of directors. Maybe they need more Black people on their board of directors. Theatre Works here in Palo Alto said they were not going to not going to have some online events that they had set up for those of us who were going to be going to real plays. And they said, we're not going to do that. Many music, the Cabrillo Festival didn't put things up on their website for a day or two. So we could reflect on what we should be doing. So I have a stack of emails because I belong to lots of different organizations, nonprofits. So this gives me hope. I hope you finding out from me that this is happening will also give you hope that it's not just people demonstrating. I was at Palo Alto King Plaza on Saturday. First time I had ventured anywhere close to anybody else since March the 17th. I'm in the old people's category. So, but there are a lot of other things going on.
Cheryl, I'm gonna thank you because you've inspired me. We're just running short of time, so
That's fine.
Cut you off a little bit.
Thank you.
That was an excellent. And this is the kind of thing. Go ahead, Clay, please.
I think the thing I would reflect on what she pointed out is that it is, as you get older, you move up the rack, move up in institutions. So you have institutional power. And so I think it's always the older people who are going to say, how do I take discontent and translate it into policy changes in my institution? You know, right now there's a very vigorous discussion, as vigorous as it can get when people are not in personal touch with each other, about what is Stanford's response to what is this historical moment. That's something that the people who were at City Hall, most of them have no impact on. But I can have an impact on that. Another, Gavin Wright, who was there before, can have an impact on that. And so that's the job of people who have institutionalized power. And if we had a decent president, you know, let's be real. You know, this president is probably will be rated as the worst president, and that takes a lot into account, because if we've had some bad
doozies.
yeah, but he might be rated the worst that we've ever had. And so I think that it is people in institutional power. I was trying to imagine how Barack Obama, who I disagreed on many policy issues, felt that he did not move quickly enough. But I can't imagine that he wouldn't have found an occasion to express empathy, to perhaps go to the Floyd funeral, to speak out in an empathetic way and say, I feel your pain. And the lack of that is striking, but I think it's always good. You know, the last speaker, you know, talking about all these institutions who take a day of reflection and say, you know, something historic has happened. How can we respond in a positive way? You know, that to me is the challenge that we have. You know, how can your organization, Paul, you know, as vigorous as you've been, I'm sure that there's a lot of self-reflection of how can we be even more vigorous?
Right.
How can we be more effective and responsive? Because this is something that is a historic turning point, when we can either go that way or this way. We can either go toward a progressive direction, or we can talk about law and order. And you know, quite frankly, I'd be willing to go either way. I don't mind talking about law and order, because when we get into who looted whom, when I'm the descendant of looted people, when we in Palo Alto are living on looted land,
Right.
when our country loots the natural resources of other countries by bribing corrupt leaders, you know, we have no standing to talk about looting. And so all of that is, to me, totally irrelevant. Let's get to the point of how this country can be made better and how it can play a more positive role in the world. And that's the challenge that is posed to us by those 18 and 20-year-olds who organized that rally at Palo Alto City Hall.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Here, let me just quickly ask you, you just mentioned President Obama and President Trump not saying anything, Trump not saying anything this time around. But I was reading reports today that the White House is working on a race relations speech for Trump to come out and give. And the real kicker is that Stephen Miller is writing the speech for him. Do you want to comment on that?
That's a comment.
Better not to have him. I'm sorry, what was that?
That was a comment in itself, just when you put those two names together.
Right.
It's I think we have, one of the reasons why I would say that he will probably go down as, the historians do this list, periodically of rating the best presidents and the worst presidents. And quite frankly, it is fairly nonpartisan. I mean, as much as we might ideologically disagree with some presidents, we recognize that they had an impact on the country, and we recognize that. But I have no doubt that if I would bet somebody money at the moment that when those ratings are done in the future, he will be among the worst. And it's partly because we've had racist presidents before. We've had presidents who are corrupt before. But when you combine corruption, lack of empathy, a presidency that is defined by bullying and all the traits that if he applied to be principal of Palo Alto High School, he would never get past the first round.
We are almost out of time here. Let me just take a moment to tell folks and show folks there's a demonstration coming up this Friday, June 12th. Justice for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and all victims of police brutality at Jack Farrell Park, 2509 Fordham Street in East Palo Alto. Sponsored by Peninsula Youth Alliance for Justice and Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. So I hope you can all make it to that. Check the Peace Center's website at peaceandjustice.org. All that will be on there. And I just want to say a quick thank you so much to Dr. Clay Carson, the founding director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. You want to leave us with a 30-second thought of some sort, Clay?
Well, I think it's always a pleasure when a historian gets to be part of a historic moment. As I said, my career began with the March on Washington in 1963, and to reach this stage in my career and watch young people taking this role is entirely something that I will treasure. So thank all those people who, one of the things I realize is that someone under 25 is probably not watching right now.
Yeah.
But convey my best wishes to them.
Okay, thank you, and my best wishes to you, and our gratitude for joining us here again. And my thanks to everybody who's tuned in. We'll be back again with Other Voices Online in 2 weeks. We're going to try this every other Tuesday at 7 o'clock, so keep an eye out. And we will be contacting you by email for some more what you can expect to find over at the King Institute. There's their website. Check it out, kinginstitute.stanford.edu. Certainly make peaceandjustice.org a daily visit, see what's going on there. And if you'd like to stop by my blog, that's at dissentment.com. Thanks everybody for joining us. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.